Hola chicas! Welcome to 20 Questions With, a podcast in conjunction with Latinitas Magazine. Latinitas Magazine is a strong voice for Latina and POC youth, which is why the hosts of 20 Questions With are all young Latinas who are looking to gain experience in innovative and creative fields just like you. In each episode, you'll hear from striking individuals who are inspiring today's youth with their passion, motivation, and grit. Today, join Angelique Hechavarria and Jackie Ibarra as they sit down and ask 20 questions with journalist Nancy Flores. Before we get started, here's what you should know about Nancy. Nancy is an award-winning bilingual journalist based in Austin, Texas. In her 17 years of storytelling, she has reported everywhere from Mexico City to Michigan. In Austin, she mostly wrote for the Austin American-Statesman and Austin360, writing breaking news, festivals, features, and community affairs. Being the daughter of Mexican immigrants, she has specialized in covering underrepresented Latino communities in Central Texas. Her contributions to Austin's Latino community has earned her the Award of Excellence in Media Arts from the city's Mexican-American Cultural Center. In 2019, Remezcla named her among the nation's Latino Columnists You Should be reading. Today, she is a news entrepreneur, editor, and publisher of Austin Viva, a soon-to-be relaunched digital publication focusing on Latino culture and community. So let's go ahead and hear what Nancy has to say.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on this episode of 20 Questions With. I'm Angelique Hechavarria, and I'm here with my co-host Jackie Ibarra and today's guest Nancy Flores. Let's get started with the questions. Would you be able to tell us your story about how you got involved in your career in the field of journalism, or why you wanted to get involved in that field?
Sure. I've been a journalist for 17 years now, working in newsrooms across the U.S. and in Mexico. And journalism really interested me just early on for its ability to, shine a light on important issues, but also tell people stories. I made it my mission a while ago to focus my journalism on underrepresented communities and especially the Latinx comunidad. And, now as a media entrepreneur, I'm getting to do that in a more deliberate way.
Yes, and something that really piqued my interest is your work in photography and videography. So I wanted to know, how did you get started getting involved in photography and videography?
Well, writing is my first love, but visual journalism is an incredibly powerful form of storytelling. I spent a few years of my journalism career living and working in Mexico City as an independent journalist. And it was there that I picked up the video camera for the first time. And, really in journalism, the more skills you have, the more marketable you are, and the more, well-rounded journalist you become. So at the time, there was no visual journalist in the Mexico City office of Cox Newspapers, which at the time owned the Austin American-Statesman. And at the time, most of my training up until then had been in reporting. So it was a completely new experience for me, but basically, pitched them the idea because they didn't have anybody. I saw that gap there, and scary at first, learning on the fly. But the more I did it, it's just the more comfortable that I became.
Yes, and growing up, did you envision yourself becoming a journalist?
Yes, actually, I've wanted to be a journalist ever since I can remember. At the time, I didn't know what type of journalist or what medium I wanted to do. I just knew that I loved writing. I enjoyed it. I even wrote for my elementary school newsletter. I did school. There was those UIL writing competitions called Ready Writing. I did that. I was the editor of my high school newspaper and then my college newspaper. I even did TV news show in high school that was produced all by students. So, I was just trying to get in there any way I could and figure out, what is this journalism stuff and, is it for me? And I'm not exactly sure, how I got the idea in my head because I am, a first generation Mexican-American. I didn't grow up around career professionals, especially there's no journalists in my family. But I do remember a teacher I had in junior high. She was a former TV journalist, and she was from the Philippines, and she would tell us about her amazing, adventures reporting. And now as an adult and looking back, I think that probably had a big impact on me, seeing a woman of color doing this. And she was like chaparrita like me and was out there making it happen with all her incredible stories. And I was like, wow, like maybe this is a possibility for me.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that, because it goes in relation to our next question, which is, how was it growing up as a first-generation Mexican-American?
Yeah, I grew up in a small border town called Eagle Pass in Texas, and it's right across Piedras Negras, Coahuila. So my family went back and forth across the border often, to visit family, to go to the doctor. My parents' hometown of Guerrero, Coahuila, it's not so far, from the border. So we spent a lot of time there growing up as well. My father had a restaurant there. So I had like my Texas friends who I saw like Monday through Friday. And then I had my, Mexican friends who I saw on the weekends. And, it was all very like interconnected. I like to say that my life was braided with cultural strands that are impossible to untangle. And, the reason I say that is because, if you think about a braid, una trenza, that it has like the 3 strands, and like one strand is like my, Mexican heritage, and the other strand is like my American upbringing. And then that third strand is like that middle space where I can go back and forth. What makes that trenza work is it's interwoven tightly, and it's a beautiful trenza. So kind of how I think about it, growing up first generation.
That's such a beautiful imagery and example. Thinking about it, it's like that middle part, sort of your individual experience and your individual upbringing that sort of ties in both of those cultural differences. And how has your journey been as a Latina in the field of journalism?
Well, it's no secret that there's a lack of representation in media, not only in the coverage, but also in the journalists producing the work. And, there's just been many times in my career where I've been, one of the only, and that can be challenging. It's one of the reasons that I became involved with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. I served on my local Austin chapter board, as well as the national board. And, their hashtag is more Latinos in news. And I'm all about that. The more diverse our newsrooms are, just the better our stories are going to be.
Yes, I agree, especially when there's such misinformation in our community. That's super, super important to have more Latinx representation. And this next question I love because I love music. I love Latin American music. So I saw on your Twitter that you said music fuels me, and I feel the same way. And I was wondering if you have a favorite artist, song, or a genre of music.
Don't make me choose. I love music, just like you. And I've been writing about Latin music for a long time as well. And yeah, I've just had the privilege of, meeting and interviewing just many greats in the music industry, from like Juanes to Lila Downs. And I can remember like back in my 20s listening to some music that combined like Latin rhythms that I was familiar with, like cumbia, with more like a more modern sound. And I just remember thinking like, what is this? I like this, but does this have a name? Like, not traditional, like Latin music. It's not pop. It was genre bending, for me. And yeah, it didn't really have a name back then. Later it became known as Latin alternative music, which is still not the best name for it, but I guess marketers at the time like created that name for the music that was coming out at the time. And actually there's a big gathering that just happened, the Latin Alternative Music Conference. It's yearly in New York. And yeah, it brings all kinds of artists together who, are producing this kind of music. And, I think the genre speaks strongly to me because it's all about the merging of cultures and identity. And yeah, it really resonates.
I love that. And growing up, I'm starting to see that there's more songs that are both in English and in Spanish. And I was wondering, do you have a goal or a dream that you would like to accomplish within the next couple of years?
For a long time, my dream was to become a news entrepreneur and own a Latinx media company. And in this past year, it's become true. And yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling, when you get to that dream, have it become a reality. Austin Viva, as you know, is a digital Latinx news and culture site. Right now, we're in the soft launch phase where we're aiming to relaunch later this year. And the goal is to launch it successfully, have it become a financially sustainable business while uplifting our comunidad at the same time.
Yes, I'll definitely be keeping an eye out. So exciting. And what is your favorite part of your career?
My favorite part is finding the heart of people's stories. Over the years, people have trusted me to share sometimes very personal and challenging parts of their lives. And, I don't take that lightly. It's an incredible privilege.
Yes, that's definitely my favorite part too, is the stories. Growing up, I loved mythological stories from my family in the past and how they lived. And of course, growing up with Disney. You love the stories and the movies and everything. And do you have any advice or tips on conveying a story in the best way possible?
Yeah, to me, I think a big part of being a journalist is sometimes you have to be a professional listener. And, a lot of people don't think about that, but I think that's the first step in trying to convey the story, is when you're fully present and listening with intention, just to really understand where the person is coming from.
Yes, I agree. And thank you, Nancy, for taking the time to chat with me today. I will be handling it over to Jackie.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. They're very insightful, and I loved hearing what you had to say because I felt like I was talking to someone that I grew up with. I have a couple questions. So my first one is, what inspired you to start Austin Viva?
Yeah, so at Austin Vida has a little bit of a history here in Austin. It actually started more than 10 years ago as a Latino lifestyle and cultural magazine, but it stopped publishing about 5 years ago. And during that time of those 5 years that there was no Austin Vida, we saw, anti-immigrant rhetoric grow in the country. We saw, a backlash against the Latinx community and, of course, a racial reckoning in the country. And, I thought it's really time to bring new life to Austin Vida and to rebuild it for a new generation.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that. And so I know you've kind of covered Latinx communities as a statesman reporter. Did that experience kind of help you push for the creation of Austin Vida? Or what made you realize that Austin's Latinx community needed its own space?
My years as a journalist, covering Latinx communities, yeah, it definitely put me on the ground floor, of conversations that were happening locally. And people were incredibly grateful when I would shine a light on the issues, they were facing in the community. And even when I was highlighting Latino arts and culture, but it wasn't nearly enough of what needed to be happening. And, Latinx people in Austin often feel overlooked, on a whole, and just not represented in the local media landscape. So I realized that it was time for me to dream bigger, to help change that.
No, yeah, totally. And exactly what you said, Austin has a very vibrant Latinx community, but a lot of people tend to not know just because that lack of coverage sometimes. So thank you. And what do you hope Austin Vida looks like content-wise? What do you hope to be producing?
Right now, we're in that soft launch period where, we're gathering community input and we're listening to the community to help shape its new chapter. And, we're aiming to produce news and culture stories that focus on, lifting our community and, we like to say illuminating the resilience that it takes to be Latinx in Austin. So, our big focuses are going to be, community and culture. And that's going to be driven by, what folks tell us.
That's awesome. I love that. And as a Latina journalist myself and a student, I've definitely felt my share of imposter syndrome in spaces where I've worked before. Have you ever dealt with imposter syndrome, and how do you overcome it?
Oh my gosh, yes, that's a big one. And I think that you're already steps ahead because you recognize it, you have recognized when it's happened to you before and you have a name for it. And I think for me, that didn't really become clear until later on in life. So I think that first step is just being self-aware, and knowing when those feelings arise, like those feelings of you don't know that you're good enough or worthy enough or all that, recognizing that that's not the real you who's talking. So, that's mostly out of fear. Right now in this entrepreneurial journey, this path is not easy. And, I'm blazing this new trail every day. I'm stretching myself like never before. And with that comes a lot of fear and a lot of imposter syndrome. And, I don't think that you overcome it as much as you learn to move forward with that fear. I really like this example. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, of like driving the car. Like pretend you're driving a car and imposter syndrome, pops up, or like fear pops up in the passenger seat, and they're like changing the radio stations, trying to take the wheel, trying to distract you from driving, and you're like, go away, I'm trying to get to where I need to go. And I think, when we think about imposter syndrome, the trick is to become friends with fear and to say, hey, I'm going to be in the car, and I know you're going to be in the car because you're annoying and never go away. And I know you're going to talk, even though I don't want you to talk, but here are the rules. Don't touch my radio. You put your seatbelt on. You keep your hands on your lap, and I'm going to be driving, not you. Fine to hang around, but you cannot drive.
No, that makes perfect sense because I always tend to ask more like seasoned journalists how they deal with it, especially journalists of color. And so a lot of them are just like, well, it's always there, but you just got to learn that like it's not something that should like hold you back. So I definitely like that car example. The Latinx community was also one of the communities of color disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Why is it important that there's a space where Latinx community can get news about this kind of thing, especially like Angelique was talking about with misinformation and a lot of them not trusting certain news organizations?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of misinformation during this pandemic and issues of trust, like you mentioned. It's important to have a space that understands the cultural nuances of the situation. And when you start the coverage from there, like already understanding and knowing those cultural nuances that you don't have to explain, when you start at that deeper level, then that resonates with the community and helps develop that trust.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned the cultural nuances. I recently started writing more about like Latinx culture, and I was doing like a particular story, and like I found myself explaining to my editor like why it was a story that mattered, because I was like, well, culturally, like it may seem like this, but it's a big deal in our culture. And so I definitely like how you mentioned that, because I think that definitely helps when you're reporting on important issues. So I know there's a page on Austin Viva about what Austin's Latinx community is saying. Why was it important that you get that feedback directly from the community?
I think, I think it's important when the community is telling you that they feel overlooked in the coverage, that's taken seriously. Their input, the feedback is going to help shape the direction of Austin Viva. And we want to know, what do you think is missing from the conversation? What information for you is hard to find? What do you enjoy reading about? And, we want to have that constant feedback with the community.
It's awesome and definitely needed. And so what has been the hardest part about creating a space like Austin Viva so far?
When the pandemic hit, everything just seemed so uncertain, and it was challenging to decide, whether or not to move forward with Austin Viva, especially as the protest arose like last summer, and then people were demanding for change, for people of color, like across the country. Then it really became clear to me that this was the right direction and that I had to bring Austin Viva to life.
That definitely makes sense. With the pandemic and working from home, it's hard to find that balance. I know I'm still kind of struggling with burnout and stuff. So how do you deal with burnout, or how do you kind of give yourself a break and find that balance?
Yeah, I go walking a lot and hiking a lot. I'm doing the 52 hike challenge, which if you haven't heard of it, is there are 52 weeks in a year. And so if you take a hike at least once a week, then you meet 52 hike challenge. And so, it helps me just to have a goal and to be able to track those hikes and to like discover different hikes around the city and different places that I go to. But yeah, I think in general, just being out in nature just brings me back to center. In Texas, we recently had the winter storm that devastated a lot of our communities, but it's also made me pay attention to this spring season where all of these plants have been coming back to life and seeing like which plants are blooming again. And, I don't think that I've ever noticed that more than this year of like, here's this tiny little leaf and now it's coming back. And then like, yay, because of the craziness that we went through with the winter storm and having, no power and water and things like that. So yeah, just being out in nature in general.
I definitely have to try that because I understand exactly what you were saying about how I didn't appreciate nature before, and because I've been trying to get outside more. And so you've had a successful career as a reporter. What advice do you have for young Latina reporters who might be scared or feel lost or, like I said, kind of don't feel like they belong in that field?
Yeah, well, first of all, know that we need you, that your voice is so crucial. I would say to find mentors who can help guide your career, especially like for first generation folks out there. I know personally, I felt like there was no roadmap that I could follow. I want to be a journalist, but like, how do I get there? And that was just such a big question mark for me. And journalism and media in general is just a very competitive industry. So I think it's especially important for young Latina reporters to be able to connect with those mentors who can help them. But also know that every path is different. What your mentor does is not going to necessarily work for you all the time, but at least you have that framework of knowing what to try and where to go. And, I think that'll just help a lot along the way. Yeah. And apply for internships. Even if you think you're not qualified, there's no reason why you should limit yourself before, somebody else says no. Like a lot of times we don't apply for internships or jobs or go out for things we want because we think that imposter syndrome kicks in and you're like, no, I think I'm not experienced enough or I don't have the qualifications you're asking for. And so we hold ourselves back before even trying. We need to try more. It's like a numbers game. Like, the more you try, then the more results you're going to have. That feeling scared is normal, and like I said, you put that fear in the car and say, I'm going to go anyway. And that's really courage when you're scared, but move forward anyway. That's being courageous.
Yeah, definitely. And I like how you mentioned, I was like, as a first gen, you really don't know what you're doing. You're just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. And so I definitely felt that way when I started college, and especially going into like trying to explain to my parents that I wanted to go into journalism. And then he was like, well, why don't you just be a doctor? And I was like, I don't like science. So that definitely makes sense. So my last question for you is, what do you hope to be the future of Austin Viva?
Yeah, I hope that Austin Viva is more than just a publication. I hope that it can help strengthen our community. And, I hope that when people see Austin Viva, that it helps them feel seen and that it helps them feel like they belong. And I think, above all else, that's my hope for Austin Viva, that, people see it and feel and know that they do belong.
That's lovely, because I know that I would have definitely benefited from seeing something like Austin Viva when I was little and seeing like, oh, I can do this. There's other people doing it. So like Angelique said, we'll be on the lookout and I'm excited to read the first issue whenever it comes out. So thank you again for taking the time to chat with us today. If you're interested in pursuing a media career, make sure to visit us at latinitasmagazine.org for more information. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of 20 Questions With. We'll see you next time.